Welcome. Today we're joined by Ann-Margaret and Brent. Ann-Margaret, Brent, please introduce yourselves.
Hi, y'all. My name is Ann-Margaret Gonzalez, and I'm the lead public affairs specialist at the Edwards Aquifer Authority. So I manage our social media outlets. I host the Recharge Zone podcast with Brent, and I manage different media relations and kind of anything communication.
Hi, Ryan. Hi, everyone. I'm Brent Doty. I'm the research manager here at the Edwards Aquifer Authority. So my part on the show is the technical expert. So when we talk to some folks with some expertise, it's my job to kind of break down what they're saying for the audience to even more easily understand.
And you have had this podcast since 2020. Can you tell us a little bit about the startup journey and how you found the purpose and narrowed exactly what the podcast would be about?
In 2020, during the pandemic, we were trying to come up with ideas on how to keep our audiences engaged on social media and the people who follow us. Of course, during that time, everyone was trying to figure out how to, actually not figuring out how to, they were successfully doing it, like starting podcasts and doing more social stuff, videos for sure. During that time, Brent and I had previously talked about starting a podcast, and it just seemed no time like the present to start a podcast during that time to kind of keep people engaged and teach them about the Edwards Aquifer. We had started the podcast actually right around the time that the San Antonio Livestock Show and Rodeo was happening during that time. So it was like maybe the month before we actually had our interns interviewing people out at the rodeo, asking them what they know about the Edwards Aquifer system, and doing kind of a fun little Q&A. And then Brent and I came back in studio, which is like our office, and basically just kind of went through some of the misunderstandings of some of the things within the aquifer. Things like, right, Brent, like people thinking it's an underground river, people assuming karst means something different than what it actually means. So Brent is the expert when it comes to all things geology and hydrogeology. And I'm our communications person that kind of makes the episodes happen.
Yeah, that's kind of how I remember it too. I also think part of my job as a scientist is educating folks on what we do here. And so when Ann-Margaret brought up the idea of a podcast, I was all about it because it's really one of the best ways to get a lot of different messages out. We've interviewed so many people over the years and brought forth content that I think was more or less hidden from the public. So it's been really a great adventure.
And you're able to build a network with people you might not be able to talk with otherwise. Can you speak a little bit about that advantage for your organization in the dimension of podcast?
Oh, definitely. We've given folks a voice that have never previously talked to the public in any kind of setting. So we've talked to modelers, to endangered species folks, to geologists, to permitting people. It's across the gamut of the agency. So folks that have never done this before, they're in a setting where we can say things more than once. We can go back and repeat stuff. So people aren't that would normally be very nervous in front of a public audience are just talking to us like a normal, like they're a normal person. So it's much easier for them, and it's just a really good avenue for that.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I know that sometimes we struggle with making our podcasts conversational. Can you talk a little bit about how you put your guests at ease?
Typically what Brent and I do is we will reach out to them, kind of prep them. Our podcast is strictly audio, although we have had one episode that we did that was on site in San Marcos, and I can speak more about that later. But so ours is essentially just audio only. So typically what we do is we preface everything. We kind of give them the rundown of what to expect. We're like, this is pre-recorded. It's not live. So it kind of puts them at ease. And we also let them know some of the questions they can expect us to ask them, but also we let them know that it's going to be an organic conversation. Like Brent was mentioning, we have had an array of people on our podcast. So we have the more kind of by the book people. We have had people go with the questions and kind of read it like a script. And so we have to kind of do things on the fly to get them to kind of answer questions more organically and have like more of a conversational style to it. And then what we also do, which has seems to help and been successful, is prior to the episode, we will sit with them and kind of talk about things. We'll have a conversation with them. And sometimes those conversations can go anywhere from like 15 minutes to 30 minutes, just chatting about things and kind of getting them comfortable and acclimated with everything. The setup is here, the soundboard, the microphones, and the headphones. So it can be a little daunting to some people who have maybe probably never done that before. So it puts them at ease, I would say. Right, Brent?
Absolutely. I think we kind of have to feel out who we're talking to. Some people, like Ann-Margaret mentioned, have difficulty going off script, so we don't really stray too much from our questions, where other people will just throw the questions out the window and go down a particular avenue that starts to sound good. And you can really tell early on, or if you know somebody, if they're like that. And those are my favorite kind of podcasts, but we still want to use people that don't ever do it. And in that case, we sort of stick to a script, more or less.
Before I ask about that script, tell us a little bit about that setup that you mentioned. Is it a Rodecaster 1 or 2, and what kind of mics are you using?
Full disclaimer, I know it's a soundboard. I don't know what it is. I have it back here, so I can even show it to you. It's a soundboard, and kind of how all of that got started in terms of doing the podcast in a very professional way. That didn't happen until closer to when we came out of the pandemic. So initially, Brent and I were doing it via Teams and Zoom. The audio would sometimes be iffy. You know, we would try to do the best we could with what we had at the time. But then, of course, we evolved and we invested in low-cost version of kind of setting up a podcast. I actually met with our IT department and kind of went through things with them. They had never done it before, but they know the ins and outs and the intricacies of all of that stuff. And I did some research, of course, like on prior podcasts and like what kind of equipment is easy to use and user-friendly. So that's how we ended up at that soundboard. It's like a soundboard with mics set up. We have this cave space that you can see behind me is the room that we typically do the podcast episodes in. I would say that's it in a nutshell. And then the podcast episodes are hosted on something called Libsyn. It transmits them to all of the other avenues where people can listen to podcasts. So Amazon Music, Spotify, SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, and you pretty much whatever you think you can find a podcast on is what our podcast is on.
The Rodecaster has been a game changer. I mean, doing interviews through Zoom, we still do that on occasion, but inevitably you get the Windows updates or email dings and interruptions in connection. So our preference is to do it in person, in the same room, all on headsets and mics, in a quiet space.
That makes a huge difference. I know that when we're first starting, we probably learned lessons along the way about having clean audio and asking the right kind of questions. Can you talk about some of the early mistakes that you learned from that you have integrated into your standard operating podcasting procedure?
I'll talk about our biggest mistake. We had a brilliant interview with a modeler named Jim Wetterly, who had been a longtime modeler, but he's also someone that can just talk to a general audience about a complex issue and with no problem. We went through the entire interview and then at the very end realized that we hadn't been recording. So we talked for the entire time and realized at the very end that we hadn't been. Now Jim was super awesome about it, and we pressed record and did it all over again. But I would say it wasn't as good as our first time around. But also, so that's right there. We put that into our procedure. Always make sure we're recording. Everyone knows it's recording. More than one person knows that. I don't know, Ann-Margaret, do you have anything else? That was the biggest one to me.
You know, early inception of the podcast and early recordings and things, it was done via Teams. And so we would say things, you know, like go in a well-lit room if you can. Make sure like your sound quality is as good as it can be, whether you're using like a microphone or, but sometimes we just kind of have to work with what we had. That's where we kind of learned a lot. I would say during the pandemic, it was a learning time for us. And then once we got the equipment and were able to kind of enhance everything that we were doing, it became more intuitive to like, of course, like setting everything up before, like this is like the things that anyone would do, but like setting things up before the people arrive, making sure that we have sent maybe a few questions to them previously so they have like some idea of what we're talking about or what we want to talk about. Those are the things that kind of come off at the top of my head. Of course, we have had phone calls in the middle of some podcast episodes and things that just kind of happen from time to time. Like I think you all heard my email just ding a second ago. So we've had things like that.
We also have tried once or twice to do a podcast out of the field. Like, there'll be some ambient noise, some birds. Maybe it'll sound great. It does not sound great at all when you do that. And we're also running off maybe an iPhone or something recording. So we did that early on, and that just didn't work. I think it's good to maybe interject some of that here and there, but not to have the entire podcast try to be at an outdoor setting or doing an activity. It just doesn't work out very well.
Those are some great lessons. Do you think of anything else that people might struggle with as they start their podcast? I used to start by sending questions, and then I realized that topics were way more effective for me personally in my podcast. Do you all like to send questions in advance, or do you like to send topics in advance?
We generally send questions, and the reason is we're almost always talking to people that are not familiar with this kind of style of communication. So it sort of puts them at ease. There are some folks here in the office that are very familiar with PR and communications. And in that case, you can just kind of tell them what we're going to talk about and not even give them anything besides that. And those are my favorite. But for folks that don't ever do this, we try to give them a little bit more.
And I would also say, too, for us in the subject matter that we're talking about, like Brent can go more into this because he's a subject matter expert. But some of the science stuff can be very science heavy. I would say depending on who we have on the podcast featured, they will either have listened to podcasts and kind of understand the lay of the land, like, okay, I got to kind of keep it concise, share interesting facts. Then the episodes will be our episodes are anywhere from like 20, 30 to 45 minutes on the longer side. But sometimes the subject matter is very dense. So we're like, you want those dense subject matter to kind of be communicated maybe in a more quicker way so that we keep the audience's attention.
Yeah, sometimes they'll have an answer and I'll realize that only a small percentage of our audience is going to understand what the guest said. And so I might break down their answer and try to ask them some follow-up questions. And so we'll go off script in that way. But sometimes we ask certain questions in order to keep them on a more understandable pathway for folks.
So it sounds like y'all know your audience really well. You're making sure that you're asking questions and getting answers for a non-scientific audience. Are there any other challenges with working with these experts that just know their domain so well as they communicate? And maybe you could give us some tips for training and helping people to communicate who have that kind of high-level academic.
Sometimes we'll have a pre-meeting before the podcast starts and kind of talk about how it's going to go exactly and how we can stop whenever we need to and repeat a question and answer it differently. And if one of us messes up, we'll actually stop and say, all right, I messed up. Let's back up and do it again. And if they say something that just didn't flow right, I might stop them and say, just stop the podcast for a minute and just talk about it and then start it again in a different direction. So we kind of act as a director, if you will, while we're doing the podcast. And if it's not going the way we need it to, we'll just stop it and kind of have a regrouping and then start it again after we're regrouped.
Whenever you're putting together the episodes, I notice you use music too. Where do you find the music to help splice in and add some different dimensions to your interviews?
Funny story about that. We had a song created. Brent used to be on the communications team way back in the day. So he understands our side of the business. And so, but way back when Brent was on our team, we were focused on water conservation. Karsten is our beloved Texas flying salamander mascot. So back then, during that time, with the leadership that we had on the communications team, they were into kind of creating a lively, exciting atmosphere within education. And so they had a song created. And so we used the instrumental version of that song because it's kind of catchy. And we don't have really a budget to work with per se for the podcast. So of course, we have the equipment and we were able to do that. And we could use royalty-free music too, for sure. But I was like, it's something that is associated and synonymous with what we do. So why not use that? So that's kind of where that little jingle comes in. And then I would say, of course, Brent was mentioning we pretty much record here at the office, but one of the fun episodes that we did, it was one of the more exciting ones. We went out to San Marcos, what I mentioned earlier, and did a glass bottom boat tour with Robert Mace. And I don't know what his exact title is, Brent.
He's the director of the Meadows Center. So at Texas State, where you ride the glass bottom boats, they have a research center there, and he's the director in charge of the whole facility there.
That one was fun because we have a videographer that we work with, and the videographer met us out there. He was game for us going on the glass bottom boat and recording. Of course, you had the driver of the boat just kind of like in the background, like, but that was one of the more fun ones that we've done.
But like in that case, we had a professional audio video guy there to handle the audio side. I think if we were doing it on an iPhone or something, it would have been a total disaster. But because we had lapel mics and boom mics, it worked really well with the ambient noise and the boat driver and those kind of noises.
Yes, that's very true. That's very true. And so like in those types of instances, and I want to, my boss is like on board with whatever direction. So we have support where we take this. And eventually I do want to do more episodes like that. It's just like, obviously this is one facet of the many things that Brent and I work on. So it's like trying to find time to fit everything in. And that's kind of what gets back to like when we do our episodes with people, we allot, an hour to an hour and a half to kind of just get everything set up. But we are working on some time constraints when we're doing it. So as concise as we can get the information, but also make it enjoyable for the listener is kind of like our goal.
How do you bridge that difference? Because you talk about the goal of making it enjoyable for listeners, but I know that science, overly technical information can sometimes not communicate the way we want it to. So how do you spice up the science? How do you make the science accessible?
Depending on our guests, I try to think of what if I were a general audience, what would I get the most interest out of this story? And so if I send the guests some preface questions, I'll think of those topics that I find most interesting. So we talk to the person who does weather modification, and just that concept alone, I think, is interesting, where we're trying to bend the weather a little bit to make it rain more in certain areas. So let's talk about, why would we want to do that? Is it safe, and how do we do it, and those sort of things? Or if it's an endangered species person, why should anyone care about these endangered species? What is it about them that makes them so unique and so interesting? So it's like trying to find topics that appeal to the most people broadly. So that's what we try to do. We don't go into the minutia of technical aspects of the modeling and how models work. It's just more about what can they do for us and how can they help.
What kind of opportunities has the podcast led you to that you might not have had without the podcast?
That episode that we were able to do out in the field. So we have taken the podcast out in the field. Like we went to San Marcos. One of our episodes, we recorded with the previous chair of our board and a board member. We've also interviewed someone from our in-house legal team too about the EAA Act. So like the history of the EAA, how the EAA got started. It's given us opportunities to sit with these people, like Brent was mentioning earlier, that you probably don't have the chance to sit with otherwise and learn so much. Like I have learned so much about the agency, and even the conversations that happen prior to like our podcast episode recordings. I also learned some background information that obviously we're not going to be sharing in the podcast. You just learn a little bit about them. Our previous deputy general manager was also on our podcast. He had been at the EAA for over 20 years. He talked about, like, he remembered it like it was yesterday, like when he started and how the culture was around here. And during that time, they were kind of trying to figure out how to implement different things. And so to me, it's given me an opportunity, and it's like living history, like the living historians, you're being able to meet with them. And it's been an honor to me to be able to sit in the room with these people who kind of essentially helped start the agency and make it what it is today. That, in a nutshell, that's kind of what I've enjoyed and what the opportunity it's given me. I feel like, what about you, Brent? What do you think?
Yeah, I definitely agree with you there. I also am really intrigued by the audience. We have the metrics that show us where these people are listening from, and I thought it would just be kind of around here, South Central Texas, but it's international. There are people in England that listen to it. There are people across the United States that listen to it, and I didn't expect that at all. So that was really interesting to hear about.
What other metrics do you all pay attention to? If you're looking at metrics for where they're listening from, what other things are you looking at and comparing from episode to episode?
I would say we typically honestly are looking at the listener, the number of listeners that we have, probably also looking at where they're mostly accessing the podcast. I would say Apple Podcast is probably one of our number ones where they're listening from. And Spotify, of course, because you have like the free version of Spotify, and it's more accessible because different services you can have different services and use Spotify. But that's typically what we do when we're getting ready to send a podcast episode out, like once it's been finished. Typically kind of how we will do it is we'll edit the audio in Adobe Audition and kind of clean it up, add the intro and the outro, add the music. We'll do a call to action at the end where it's like, send us questions. Feel free to share this on social, because we then share it on social. I'll make the graphic card for the episode too. And that's also fun too. So I get to use my creative side to do that. We will send it out in various forms. So of course we'll send it out on social, in social stories. And then we'll also send it out as an e-blast to people that are on our news drop publication list, or the people who have wanted to know general information about our agency. So we'll send it out to that list in an e-blast too. So there are various avenues with which we disseminate, the recordings and the episodes. And then something else that's interesting, that kind of going back to what you had asked earlier, getting people's attention and grabbing it. Brent and I will try to come up with intriguing, captivating ways to title the episodes, kind of like the hook, like getting them in. And when we're sharing it on social, the description for the episode, we'll try to do our best to kind of portray it in an interesting way so that people listen. It's fun to kind of go back and look at the episodes that have had the most listens. Like I mentioned earlier, the EAA Act one, that one was probably one of our most popular ones. And that one is very interesting. Like if you're into understanding how the Edwards Aquifer became protected, that's the one you want to listen to.
It sounds like there's a lot of big wins here. We talked a little bit about the failures. What are some other big wins that have come from your podcast distribution? Have you had some more shares on social with certain episodes?
We have had 35 episodes in total. So that's also something else that we have done over the years. Is when we first started, we were doing like an episode per month during the pandemic. And we pivoted to doing an episode every other month. And that has seemed to work well. Quality over quantity. When we were just focusing on EAA staff, it's easier to secure those interviews and things. But when we started venturing out and getting other guests, we decided to do it every other month. So it gives us time to plan for these things. And it gives our guests time to also plan too. Some of the fun episodes that we have been calling them are like E.T. Not the Alien. So it's evapotranspiration. And that was during like Halloween time.
Yeah, having a little pun or some kind of joke about, if we're talking about something like a water right or a permit, something that's sort of boring, but if we come up with an intriguing angle to it, it helps.
Then we also have one that's like a well-told story about groundwater protection. That episode was about wells within our jurisdiction. Trying to make it catchy, trying to like hook the audience in is one of our goals. And I would say the probably the ones that get listened to more, for example, the one that had the video, that was a one-off kind of thing that we don't typically do. That one got a lot of listens. Our general manager, whenever we do interviews with our general manager on the podcast, those tend to get a lot of listens too at the same time. I would also say too, if our episode is kind of following a current event trend or like something that maybe has been currently in the news, those tend to get a lot of listens as well.
Yeah, I think that one at the Meadow Center, the outdoor one, was also about the worsening drought, and that was in a lot of media at the time, so that just boosted it even more.
Have you seen a synergy between the messages that you're putting in the podcast, the messages that you're sharing on social, and the impacts of this kind of relationship in your communication channels?
I would say so for sure. Brent is also featured on our social. So with a lot of our social content, we also talk about our field research park. So it's where they're actively conducting research to learn more about the aquifer. And Brent is like the research person. So he manages the research efforts at the EAA. He's featured in a lot of our videos. And then also, obviously, on the podcast, people see him more, they listen to him on the podcast. He does a great job of educating people too. So to me, that's something that has always been useful and helpful for the podcast. Like, I would probably need to do a lot more background information if it was just me solely doing the podcast, because Brent has the institutional knowledge of a lot of the subject matter and the things that we're talking about. He's able to ask those questions. I'm able to ask the questions from the perspective of just like your everyday average person. I know more probably than your average person about the aquifer, so I kind of know the little questions that kind of can spin off of different things. But Brent will bring like the history, will bring the different sides of aquifer education to the table when we're talking about stuff.
Yeah, that's kind of my favorite part is Ann-Margaret deals with the technical aspects of the podcast itself, the recording and editing, and I just have to worry about kind of the technical content within the podcast, which I enjoy.
We talk about news value for public relations, but in podcasting, there's a similar value component. And since both of you have that background in communications, being communication pros, maybe you can shed a little bit of light on what you look for in the editing process and in the pre-interview process to say, ooh, this is something we really want to highlight.
We really want to convey sort of the mission of the EAA and each and every podcast, and that's to manage, enhance, and protect the aquifer. So no matter what we talk about, who we're talking to, it has some aspect of that mission behind it. And that's kind of the whole purpose of the podcast, is to get people to understand these issues. So when it comes to policy making decisions and there's public comment, we want people to weigh in and be informed on that. And that's the ultimate goal, is to have a more informed citizenry that can benefit the aquifer. So each and every one of these issues, there's science behind it and there's policy behind it. And we're trying to convey that to a really broad audience.
When communicating things and kind of deciding on the topics, Brent and I will have a meeting typically at the beginning of the year or even at the end of the previous year, and kind of discuss what we envision for this coming year. Of course, I have to vet it through my boss, and he is supportive of the subjects that we're talking about and the things that we're talking about because they relate directly to the agency itself. Things like thinking about the holidays, certain episodes might come out during certain times of certain holidays, and we'll find a way to incorporate it. Things like during the summer, we tend to be in an extreme drought, going through critical period management stages. Yes. And so we'll have Roland on, and we'll talk about that subject matter. So of course that ups the listens for that and people tuning into those types of episodes. So we're intentional about what subjects we pick for the year. They tend to follow some of the initiatives of the agency, so it kind of plays nicely with everything. From time to time, some of our written stories in the news drop will also have accompanying podcast episodes. So it's just that it's kind of a continuation of communication for the different avenues, like we're hitting them at every or like corner. You can read it, you can listen to it, you can listen to an abbreviated version on social. So we're trying to kind of get everything in there.
And in the research and planning phase, I imagine there's other challenges that pop up more frequently. Can you talk about the research and planning phase specifically from the show level, like planning your whole year, and in the individual episode level? I'm sure there's different challenges in both.
We try to kind of sketch out a season, if you will. So for each year, we choose guests and topics that are going to be meaningful. Like Ann-Margaret mentioned, if we're facing prolonged drought, we want to talk to experts in climate and droughts, like Dr. Mace in that instance. And then for each individual episode, which questions are going to be most impactful on the topic and which avenues are going to be most interesting to the audience. And that's kind of, from my perspective, how we handle that.
When we're doing, so if you kind of think about it like in a linear kind of way, it's like Brent and I discuss the subjects for the year for the podcast episodes. And then sometimes, of course, we have to pivot because something is not working out or something's not fitting. Someone schedule cannot allot for it for that specific time. And we're pretty much always recording a month in advance of the podcast airing. As much as we would like to pre-record the episodes in advance and kind of have them stacked for the whole year, it won't necessarily work that way because you'll have new revelations or bits of information that would have come out. So it just doesn't make sense to do it that way. We do that, and then we schedule and coordinate with them for the podcast episode. We'll give them some kind of pointers and things to remember and things to consider. And then questions, of course, we'll prep them and coach them a little bit. And then, of course, when we meet with them in person for the day of, we will talk about things prior to the episode and prior to recording. Most of the time, I think too, since Brent and I have been doing this, we've come to find that, we have like maybe 3 top questions that appear somewhere in the episode that we've asked, but then the conversations kind of happen more organically. I think too, when you have more organic conversations, it eases the guests because they get lost in the mix. Like they're just like, oh, okay, I'm having a conversation. They kind of forget that all of this is here and all of this setup is happening.
You mentioned coaching. Can you speak a little bit about the kinds of advice you give to your guests?
Some guests are really, really nervous right out of the gate, just to do a pre-recorded podcast. And so that's when we talk them through how it's going to work. Not only can they repeat things, but after Ann-Margaret finishes the edit, I review the edit to make sure that something isn't said that can be misinterpreted or is technically incorrect, and we'll cut that part out. So that takes that burden off of them, that they're not going to say something that could come back to bite them in the end, because we check for content and make sure that there's not any pitfalls there. And so that sort of puts them at ease a lot of times.
We have to fact check things because, of course, when you're having conversations that are being recorded in real time and someone doesn't have like their data to pull up exact, figures and numbers and things like that, we'll put them at ease because, of course, we'll say, we can stop and you can find that information, or you can just give like an estimate, or we can just take it out completely because it didn't match what they actually needed to say. And those things are important too when you think about like quality control for some of the things that we're communicating. We are an agency that's looked at. We can't be having misinformation go out there, and at no fault to anyone's other than they're like, oh, I'm having a conversation with someone, and it's almost like they forget that sometimes. We're like, we'll ease your mind, and that stuff won't make it and won't appear in the episode.
Yeah, I don't want it to come up at a board meeting, a public comment, oh, on your podcast episode such and such at minute 5, this was said. Is that really the opinion of the EAA? We try to really avoid that kind of stuff. And if I can take that off of the listener's mind, that not burden them with that's on us, that really helps them out.
Can you speak a little bit about the implementation and evaluation procedures that you've put in place to ensure that your podcast is meeting your high standards?
That's kind of on me, at least in the content realm, to make sure that it's technically sound, that we're not putting out misinformation, and then on Ann-Margaret's side of things to make sure that it's cohesive and that the edit cuts out the things that need cut out the most, and it still sounds like continuous audio.
And the evaluation of the metrics, have you seen specific numbers that say, ooh, maybe we made a mistake there, oh, we really hit this one out of the park? And maybe you can give us some insights into the ones that really worked well, what maybe you might have done differently.
Yes, I would say when it comes to like metrics and things, we as much as I'm trying to figure out how to say this, as much as we would want to like really focus on the analytics behind a lot of the episodes and things, our audience is like, we know they're listening, and we do look at that to kind of gauge interest and kind of see what people are interested in. And also too, some of the ways in which we plan our episodes is also dictated by current, like I mentioned earlier, current events, current subject matter, current topics that people are picking up about the Edwards Aquifer in the news, and maybe questions that we have on social or that we have had in the past from people. I would say more so that's kind of the approach that we take, is not really drilling too much into the analytics. I would want to get to a point where we are doing that and doing it more thoroughly and kind of looking into it and reading into it more. For what we have done and what has been kind of meaningful to us is just kind of making sure that the content that we're putting out there is interesting to people, but also informative. Whenever I'm talking to someone, and I'm sure other people here at our agency do it too, I will always reference the podcast because there's, like Brent was mentioning, this information that we share on the podcast is not something that you will necessarily find on our website. It's a quick listen, whether you're in your car or you're working out or you're doing, things around your house. you can educate yourself up on our agency. And if you listen, if someone wanted to listen from the very beginning and listen all the way to what we have now, you would have a pretty well-rounded snapshot of what we do as an agency. And that's always been the goal, is to create some history and some historical audio for people to listen to that years down the road they can still access, and it will still be relevant. It's still interesting for people to listen to.
I think what makes podcasting so special is all of a sudden you could be learning something when you would otherwise not be doing anything except maybe a chore or driving, maybe listening to music. If you were actually listening to something that you could learn from it. And I think people are picking up on that. Like, oh, this is valuable time that I would otherwise not have. So that's what makes podcasts so popular.
Do you have any stories from the podcast that you want to highlight to say, ooh, this was a big win? When we interviewed this person, they told a story that really helped to move the needle or advocate for the aquifer, which is a resource that everybody depends on.
I think Ann-Margaret may have mentioned this one before. We interviewed an outgoing board member who had been on the board essentially the entire existence of the Edwards Aquifer Authority, and she had been on the board since I was in high school. She told some stories of things that I didn't even know about. So it's like legacy data, legacy information that would have been lost without this medium for her to talk about it. For me, that was a huge highlight.
That one definitely, for sure. Like I said, it's been an honor to do all of these episodes and meet with these people who have essentially helped found the EAA. That was a pretty good one. I would also say Brent and I had interviewed representatives from the city of San Marcos and the city of New Braunfels, and Brent can get into the specifics, but essentially, like, we have threatened and endangered species that we protect, and it's a part of the Endangered Species Act. And so we have the Edwards Aquifer Habitat Conservation Plan. They do a lot of work in the Springs communities, protecting the species and conservation measures and things, and they're in the process of re-upping their permit for a longer duration of time to protect the species. And so, Brent, right, the people that we featured on that specific podcast episode had been doing this work for a few decades, and they had a lot of successes to speak of. And it was so interesting, and it was fun to be a part of it because they were so passionate about what they were talking about.
Absolutely. Yeah, we get a lot of stories that would otherwise not come to light. And we also have talked to a lot of people that have since retired. So it's sort of their swan song was to talk about their legacy and what they've done their entire career, which, again, otherwise no one would even know. So that was really special. There's been at least a few of those.
And the role of the podcast in protecting that institutional knowledge for future generations. I'm so glad that you spoke to that earlier, too, because it is a historical record that is of great value, especially to all San Antonians and everyone who lives in this area, anyone who pulls water from the aquifer, right?
People can go back and they can listen to any one of these.
How do you define the controversy that you see in these topics, and how do you attack more controversial topics on your podcast?
I think a good example is the endangered species. So a lot of people, they wonder why we have so many restrictions on water to protect a salamander, say, that nobody ever really sees. And so you talk about it like, well, why should it mean to them? Why should it be meaningful to them? And talk about, well, by protecting this salamander, you're actually protecting your entire water supply, which does impact you. So we try to get an angle at which the audience knows that it does affect them, even though seemingly it doesn't. So we kind of look at it like that. Why should you care?
Yes, and I would also say, too, I know I keep going back to this one, but when I think of controversy, I think of the EAA Act and how the agency was founded and how it got started, its origin story. With that, like when we had our legal representative, Darcy, on the podcast, he literally has like probably an encyclopedia of our agency in his head. He can recall so many different things that have happened along the timeline of our agency. And back in the day, there was a lot of controversy. There was a lot of conflict. There were people at odds with what we were doing. And, it's water and it's Texas. So people are like, it's my water. That was it. It was interesting to talk about it because you see how far the agency has come from that conflict and controversy and litigation that was happening. Of course, we have that sprinkled in every now and then. Something else that has been happening within the last decade under our current general manager's leadership is it's like regulation through service. So it's and Brent can speak to this more, but it's letting people know that we are essentially, at the end of the day, we regulate, but we're also here to protect and work with other entities to help protect the Edwards Aquifer.
When you were first learning about podcasting, where did you go to learn all of these skills? Because we just talked about the skills of navigating controversy. We've talked about sound editing. We've talked about audition. We've talked about the research, planning, implementation, and evaluation processes of creating a great podcast. Where do you recommend people go to learn more about podcasting?
YouTube. I mean, I go to YouTube for so many different things. It is such a great resource to learn about podcasting. Obviously, you. And then I would say, too, listening to podcasts, seeing different ways with which people do them. Of course, there's recording in real time. There's live podcasting. There's pre-recorded podcasting, audio only, video only. So those are different things. I would say YouTube is such a great resource. I have dabbled in it before, and I hadn't used it for podcasting per se, but Skillshare is also somewhere where you can go, and they have like the modules where you can learn about it. But YouTube it has such good information about getting started, what kind of equipment to use. So on various budgets of how you want to do it too. So I think those are good resources.
If you could give one piece of advice for people trying to start their podcast or improve the podcast they've started, what advice would that be?
Make sure that your podcast has a meaning behind it. Maybe it's just an entertainment podcast, or maybe it's just informative like ours, but does it have a mission? What is your ultimate goal? You're not just, you need some kind of mission or reason for doing it. You don't want to just willy-nilly make a podcast every month about anything.
Be authentic, let your personality shine and show through, because I mean, anyone can make a podcast, and everyone is different. Everyone has a different perspective, life experience, and things that they can recall on to share within their podcast. So the more authentic you can come across and allow your personality to shine, I think that makes such a difference. It makes people want to tune in and want to hear more.
I think that a lot of people, especially when they're starting, are hesitant to share their personality and to share themselves. Can you talk a little bit about how to overcome that fear? And maybe this could be advice for your guests and for yourselves as you start your podcast.
I would say for me, because, I'm on the communication side of the house, and I have an appreciation and a love for science. Like, I learned so much working here. It's so enjoyable to me. Probably something when I first started was like, I don't know the intricacies of some of the subjects that we're talking about. I don't want to come across like I don't know anything. And so I kind of was maybe more subdued at the beginning. And that's why I appreciate so much that Brent is on the podcast, because he has that institutional subject matter knowledge. There's the dynamic of having more than one person on the podcast, since it's two hosts and then a guest, or sometimes it's two hosts and then two guests. The conversation just kind of flows more organically. And I think when you have more people in the room to talk to, you kind of let your guard down. Like, your podcast will your personality will just come out naturally,
And likewise, Ann-Margaret has a master's degree in communications. I didn't know anything about audio settings or how to publicize our podcast and get it out there. So it's so awesome that she can do that. And I agree also with having multiple people in the room. Some of my favorite podcasts, they all have multiple folks talking. And I always wondered, kind of why they did that. And some of them don't really say much sometimes, but it's just to make it more organic, the experience.
What are some of y'all's favorite podcasts that you would recommend to our listeners?
I'm a lighter listener, you might say. So my favorites are Conan O'Brien Needs a Friend and the Smart List podcast with Jason Bateman, Will Arnett. But I also like some more serious ones. I like there's a Science Friday podcast.
I listen to more like in my free time. Like, I obviously will listen to podcasts that have to do with the science and more technical kind of stuff. But personally, I listen to religious podcasts. So I'll listen to like more in that realm of things. So like there's a podcast called, it's like Girls Gone Bible. They do a podcast episode and they talk about things like that. So I kind of go more personal and listen to certain things like that with mine. And then Science Friday, like Brent was saying, that's such a good one to listen to. And then of course, like not necessarily podcasting, but like TPR, Texas Public Radio, always has good stuff on there. And I kind of take tips and pointers from that as well.
What are some specific things that you've learned from these podcasts that you love that you've been able to then pull from and apply to your own podcast?
From my perspective, like I said, that they have multiple folks to sort of lighten the mood. And if someone's getting off track or a little too serious, they'll just throw something out of nowhere that sort of changes the subject and changes the tone. And I found that pretty interesting, and I have implemented that.
Yes. And I would also say too, something that I enjoy is like, I enjoy storytelling. I enjoy hearing people's stories, not a lot, but like some of the podcasts where we've featured people who have been at the agency for a while, they have these great stories to tell. And it's so interesting because it's like, you know, when they were first starting out, they were venturing into the unknown. They were kind of figuring everything out and making their way and paving a way for themselves. And it's also, to me, sitting in the room with people who had been here for a while, like Brock and Darcy, they get to recall all of the experiences they've had. And, you know, we get to thank them for everything that they've done to kind of get the agency to where it is. Those storytelling aspects, when people are able to share their stories that maybe they haven't had a chance to share otherwise, the more personal side of their story. To me, that's what really has, what I've picked up from a lot of the podcasts is that authentic storytelling that people have just naturally.
Yeah, and I'll add, you know, Conan O'Brien needs a friend. Yeah, Conan O'Brien, he's a comedian and all that, but he's also been an interviewer for more than, 30 years. So he's really adept at interviewing people and getting out of them what he's looking for, which is their story and their genesis. And so the way that he asks questions, I pay attention to that probably, more than the average listener. Like, how is he asking them these questions? So what is he after? So you actually learn a lot, even from someone who on the outset looks like a comedian, but really is a professional interviewer.
I'd love to hear some advice on how to get those great stories as an interviewer. Do you have anything that maybe you've learned from not only your experiences, but from listening to these other podcasters?
Usually we're talking to these subject matter experts. So obviously they have an existing passion for the topic. And it's not hard to sort of tease that out of them to go more in depth. Like the weather modification episode, that lady was a meteorologist, and it wasn't hard to get her to talk more because you could tell that she loved it. And so as soon as you see them, their interest peaked in a question, you just keep asking them follow-up questions. And then all of a sudden they're doing all the talking and you're just listening, which is really neat.
So following the energy sounds like what we're doing to make sure we get those great stories. Are there any other tips for managing the conversation beyond following that passion and that enthusiasm with your interview guests?
I would say when it comes to to managing the conversation with some of the guests that we have had, sometimes we make it through what we had envisioned talking about. So like Brent and I were saying, we have some prep questions that we give them, but sometimes we don't. And sometimes we go completely off of those questions and we venture into a more interesting facet of the top subject matter that they were going to talk about. So in those instances, we just let it go. Like, it's completely fine. There's not like some kind of set, like we have to follow this. Like, and if we don't follow this, it goes in the garbage. Like, no. So we let the guests lead the conversation. And it also depends, like, it goes back to the personality thing. Some people are very comfortable with the podcast episodes and recording, and some people are not too comfortable with it. They might say, like, they might not outright tell us, I never want to be on the podcast again, but they might just be like, kind of like, Homer Simpson going into the bush. Like, I don't want to be a part of that anymore. I think it just depends too. And in managing the episode and, managing our time, because we have to be cognizant of their schedules and ours as well. I think those questions help ease them and provide some guidance. And then when we get started and start recording, the people who were like, holding their paper, like, ready to just like go off of it, they just slowly, put it aside and they're just able to have a conversation with us.
And that's such an art. And I know that there's lots of different skills that make this such an important art. What are some specific skills and actions specifically that you think people should take to help their podcast thrive?
Being comfortable with your equipment, being comfortable with like where you're going to be recording. You don't want to come across stressed or like you don't know what's going on or you're trying to like troubleshoot everything. So to me, being prepared in advance is always something that's helpful, because then when you get into the room, the energy in the room is calm. You're just like ready to start the episode. I would also say too, location of where you're going to be doing this. If you're recording in a meeting space, or like, are you recording, on the patio of a Starbucks? Of course, that's not going to be comfortable to some people, So like, of course, where you're going to be recording is important. Audio quality, audio sound. You want to ensure that you can hear them and that they can hear you, and making sure that all that stuff is taken care of. Because like Brent was saying, we had that one kerfuffle where we had to re-record. And of course, like Jim was like a trooper and he was getting ready to retire. So he was like, sure, I have time to do it all over again. And he like literally did it all over again perfectly, like seamlessly. But you don't want to tell your guests like, oh, unfortunately, that was all good, but we forgot to hit record on the button. So to me, just having those cues for yourself add to that. Reading up on some of the things. Of course, you want to know who your guest is. You want to know how to pronounce their name correctly. You want to know what their title is. You want to know a little bit about what they do or what you plan on talking about with them. Kind of maybe some notes on what you plan to add to the conversation. Of course, everything can come across really authentic, and you can throw everything out the window and just like let the conversation flow. But I do think you need to have some kind of starting place. You wouldn't want to record for like 3 hours and be like, okay, let's get the best, let's get the best 1 hour out of that. It's not going to really work that way. So some kind of plan, I think, is always helpful. I'm a planner, so that I enjoy that planning aspect of things.
You have one key takeaway you could leave our audience with as we wrap up?
One key takeaway: podcasting is an amazing experience for both the host and the guest and the listener. It's an old medium, but it's becoming more popular. And the reason it is, like I said, people have learned that they can use podcasts during other mundane tasks to learn more and hear more and get more interested in topics.
I like that. And then for me, it's don't be scared to start and don't be scared to make mistakes. No matter like what age you're at, everyone makes mistakes. We're all adulting as best as we can. So to me, I'm like, if you never start, you'll never know where you can go, and you'll never know the possibilities of where the journey will take you with podcasting. So that's my key takeaway in a nutshell.
Ann-Margaret, Brent, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate you sharing your insights and valuable time to help people to become better podcasters. Can you share your full name, titles, and where people can find you online?
Absolutely. And thanks for having us, Ryan. My name is Brent Doty. I'm the research manager at the Edwards Aquifer Authority. And my email is B as in boy, D as in dog, OTY at edwardsaquifer.org.
And my name is Ann-Margaret Gonzalez, and I'm the lead public affairs specialist at the Edwards Aquifer Authority. You can find me on LinkedIn by searching my name. You can find me on social popping up in videos for our agency, but you can also email me at agonzalez@edwardsaquifer.
And be sure to check out their Recharge Zone podcast, wherever you find your podcast services. Thank you both again. Appreciate y'all.